Hello, it's King Asin. I want to share how the creative visionaries and icons who inspired me continue to light my path. In today's reflection, I'll discuss the qualities that made them my guiding stars and how you can identify them in your own life. Let their passion spark your journey. I want to today start out by discussing someone who is my personal favorite artist of all time, which is kind of a tough person to distinguish due to the fact that there are so many artists of different sorts that I love who I think are great. But that artist is named Caetano Veloso, and he was born in 1942 in Santo Amaro in the state of Bahia. Now, I want to, before getting into or without getting into his story as much, I want to get into my own story as it relates to him. In 2002, as I've mentioned in other stories, I visited Salvador Bahia the first time. And when I did, it was the beginning of Carnival. But prior to that, I'd had some experience encountering Brazilian music, of course, bossa nova, the soundtrack for Black Orpheus, Orfeo Negro, and Red Hot in Rio, to mention a few. But I hadn't really gotten into Brazilian music. And one morning at the table with some friends and fellow travelers, my good friend of mine, Masio, had put on a collection of the best of Georgie Ben. It was called 20 Años Depois, or 20 Years After. So it was a greatest hits collection. And I remember sitting and eating and then hearing this music and looking up like, wow, this is some of the best music I'd ever heard. And it made me want to dig into Georgie Ben. And I found out that he had written the song Mas Que Nada, which was popularized by Sergio Mendes in the Brazil 66. And that was the first person that I caught into. And he described his music as saúde, or health, which was very deep to me, because having integrity in music or in artistry should be healthy for you and healthy for whomever is experiencing it in the audience or as an observer. And I wanted to describe that as foreshadowing to the encountering of Caetano's art. I was turned out by Georgie Ben's music. I wanted everything that I could find by him. I was collecting him, but he really opened the door for me to want to learn about other artists. So I'm learning about Vinicius de Moraes and Toquinho and Gilberto Gil, who I actually saw during Carnival playing, which was a big deal. But I was at a record store with my good friend Lamar, who'd actually brought me to Brazil. And I saw a record cover, or a CD cover, with a man whose face was half painted in the style of Federico Fellini's Satyricon. And I'm a Fellini fan. I'm a fan of Fellini's films like Casanova and, of course, Satyricon and others. And I remember asking Lamar, I tapped him, I said, "Who is that?" And Lamar just looked at me and smiled. He said, "That's Caetano." And he said it in such a way where he was communicating to me that this is someone that you need to know. So I didn't buy that record, but I bought a Best of Caetano Veloso record. And immediately when I heard it, I said, this person is special. I was still learning Portuguese, but the way that he delivered his lyrics and the way that he layered different styles of music was just so creative and interesting that it made me want to know everything about him. And I was learning about the movement that he was a part of. He actually had moved to, he's from Bahia, as I stated, but he'd moved to Rio with his sister, who had achieved a part in a play that was actually a part held by iconic Brazilian singer Nara Leone. And he was accompanying her as a brother chaperone. But while he was there, he got into bossa nova, which was in the early 60s becoming popular. So he was a formerly art student, painter, and film maker hopeful. But something about music just drew him in. And he was around other writers and poets and musicians like his sister and the people who she was collaborating with, like Gilberto Gil and Edu Lobo and people like that. And he had to make a decision as to whether he was going to be involved in filmmaking or music. And fortunately for us, not to say he wouldn't have been a great filmmaker, but fortunately for us, he got into music. And he started to collaborate with the people who were around him, like Gilberto Gil, like his sister, of course, like Gal Costa, rest in peace, like Rogério Duprat and Tom Zé, very creative thinkers. And it was and As Mutantes, or the Mutants, who were the young guard of the Brazilian wave of rock music, who the Brazilian left-wing students were very critical of in that very explosive time in Brazil, because there was a military dictatorship, and you had these new thoughts and very controversial philosophies coming into play. It was like a culture and idea clash at the time. And the group that they had, that Caetano, Gil, and a lot of his other collaborators had named the Tropicalistas, were leading the charge in being critical of the military government. And they were making some great music. But that music and the statements that they were creating actually got them into trouble. They were imprisoned and eventually exiled for a number of years when Caetano moved to England, where he was not happy because he was away from his tropical home, but he was able to strengthen his musical ability being around and collaborating with groups like Pink Floyd at the time in the late 60s and early 70s. When he'd returned back to Brazil, very welcomed by his fans and followers, he was able to incorporate what he had been learning, as well as things that he had become interested in, like different global sounds, African sounds, folk sounds. And that's something that really attracted me, because I'd always been a fan of diverse types of music, you know, whether it be folk, whether it be rock, whether it be island music, African music, of course, hip hop music, you know, it's all music. And that's something that Caetano was able to understand. And he was very prolific. And as an existentialist, you know, someone who was very in tune with the state of being as a human, it allowed him to feel and creatively express ideas that relate and express important things to be aware of in terms of the human condition, but also things to encourage self-awareness to listeners, which is important because self-awareness allows you to have objectivity, which allows you to connect with other people. And he's a hero of many. He's a hero of mine. And at 82 years old, he's still going, still young and vibrant, because that existential pursuit has allowed him to have, as Deepak Chopra called it, ageless body and a timeless mind. And that's something that's inspired me. And his awareness, his prolific output, his acknowledgement of himself as a global citizen is something that I've admired and pursue on my own in terms of my journey. Okay. The second creative that I wanted to discuss is, rest in peace, Ramel Z, who, as far as the world knows, has always had that name. And people who might know any other name he's had have made a point not to disclose it, because Ramel, who is a visual artist and recording artist and has influenced many, especially in the hip hop world, but also other alternative types of music, and definitely in art, has very much lived in his philosophy and his expression as a Gothic futurist. Now, let's talk about that. What's a Gothic futurist? A Gothic futurist, according to Ramel Z, is a monk who is very esoterically aware of the power of the letter and what the letter means as a symbol, but also what the letter represents as a weapon. And Ramel, who grew up as a aerosol artist, which some people call a graffiti writer, always looked at the lettering of used in graffiti as a means of what he called iconoclast panzerism, which is the use of the letter as an assault or a pushback against the matrix that is the modern era colonialist, imperialist system or program in which we live. He looked at the subways as the blood system. He looked at subway lines and subway tunnels as veins, and he looked at subway cars as the same as the movement of blood, platelets, and corpuscles through the veins that are the subway tunnels. And he looked at each subway car as a page. And language and lettering is something that he did not take lightly. And anyone who was associated with him as a Gothic futurist, which included people like Toxic and A1 and Cool Core, and even a Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was definitely a deep thinker and creative sponge. But as Ramel Z would describe Basquiat, he said he wasn't a visionary. He said, I'm a visionary. Basquiat is a sponge. He's a great absorber. I think both are valuable. But at any rate, Ramel Z was very intentional and very proactive in creating a philosophy that was intent on freeing the mind against the, as they say in the movie Dune, the mind killers, the programmers, the matrix imposers, that are the people that control the language in which the people in society speak. So it gets really deep, but I think that depth and critical thought are something that are important to arts and art. And I think that is the reason why Ramel Z inspires me, because he's not just an artist in terms of creating vision, which I respect, but he's an artist just like Caetano with philosophy and self-awareness. And his vocals in his music that he's done on different records like Bebop, and he's appeared in the movie Wild Style. He calls it Gangsta Duck, but it's a style very much influenced by Sir Nose that you often hear in Parliament Funkadelic records by George Clinton, another existentialist and someone who had a fun way of expressing deep, very critical thinking points. But interestingly enough, Ramel Z is where is Ramel Z from? Ramel Z is from Far Rockaway, Queens, just like Shock G of Digital Underground, who's also influenced by Parliament. Now, in my effort to connect the dots, you see me connecting different people: Shock G, Ramel Z, Parliament, Funkadelic, the Iconoclast Panzerists. You know, when you study Funkadelic's philosophy, you see how critical they were of what they would call the disco blahs and Sir Nose devoid of funk, who was a character representing someone who was not hip, a square. And when you look at his nation or his following, you find Africa Bambaataa within that. You can look on one of the backs of Funkadelic's records and find Africa Bambaataa or Bambaataa Asim's name. So before I get too far out there, let me just say that Ramel Z is someone who still inspires me with his work and his deep philosophy as a Gothic futurist, monk, and iconoclast panzerist. And I have always wanted in my work to, in a way, continue his work by continuing to develop a philosophy to construct awareness within myself as well as in others, and create a network of people who move together to spread and develop awareness as artists and thinkers. The third visionary that I'd like to discuss who influenced me is Mr. Maurice White, the founder of Earth, Wind, and Fire, originally from Mississippi. No, I'm sorry, not Mississippi. He's from Memphis, Tennessee. Maurice White started out as someone who was playing jazz and music with the likes of Stax luminaries like Booker T and David Porter, who was Isaac Hayes' creative partner. But he also was connected to the Chicago scene due to the fact that he would visit his stepfather and mother, who lived in Chicago. And from there, he was playing with chess records sessions with people like Muddy Waters and Etta James and Howlin' Wolf as a drummer. And he also linked with Ramsey Lewis, the maker of the iconic hit Sun God, which you can hear Earth, Wind, and Fire singing on. But when dealing with Maurice's development through time, you can see how Maurice's interest in jazz and blues and soul, with a new immersion into the ancient esoteric arts, history, and anthropology of the East, particularly Egypt, made him want to create something greater. And what he created was a concept act called Earth, Wind, and Fire, based on the elements in his astrological chart. And from there, he created a group of like-minded musicians, maybe not so like-minded philosophically, but definitely like-minded artistically. And down the line, he incorporated Mr. Philip Bailey, who's from Denver, Colorado. And that was the blueprint for the Earth, Wind, and Fire that rose to popularity. Now, the thing that I really respected, amongst many things about Maurice, was that he was able to combine musical knowledge with diverse philosophy and have the philosophy match seamlessly in terms of how the music was developed, the layering of notes, the arrangements, even if they were discussing topics perceived to be mundane, you could not deny that there was a synergy between the depth of philosophy that was embodied in the imagery projected by Earth, Wind, and Fire and some of the themes like Serpentine Fire with the musical construction. It went together so well, and it was perfect for the time, the 1970s into the 80s. And something that was interesting to me that I discovered was that Maurice and Philip Bailey were the only voices on Earth, Wind, and Fire, apart from the Emotions, who backed them up on songs like Boogie Wonderland. But when you listen to Earth, Wind, and Fire, After the Love Is Gone, and That's the Way of the World, and You Can't Hide Love, it sounds like 100 people singing, but it was just Maurice and Philip. But that philosophy, esoterics, musical development and harmonics, complexity, but harmony just was really inspiring as a complete vision and expression. And it always made me admire Maurice as the founder, because Maurice, it was his brainchild. And I remember when I was in high school, I'd heard these songs as a small child, and it was just the soundtrack or the soundscape that was happening in the 70s and the early 80s. But in the mid to late 80s, when my brother had moved away to college and I was still living at home, I had taken the Best of Earth, Wind, and Fire album and started to play it on my own stereo. And I would just stare at the cover, looking at that Egyptian iconography and pondering how this imagery and this philosophy connects with the music, because it felt like it connected, and it definitely resonated within me. And it made me inspired to want to, in my creativity, always express something culturally significant, definitely keeping in integrity, and something that all the artists that I've described tonight share. And I wanted to bring it back home to, is that you can be successful and still have integrity. That's probably the most important thing when being a creative, keeping your integrity, because the integrity inspires the passion, which is what will make you prolific and productive. Let me not forget this, and this is important. One of the main and most important collaborators with Maurice White when working on Earth, Wind, and Fire productions was Mr. Charles Stepney, a Chicago native who worked also at Chess Records with Maurice and several of their artists, and developed groups like the Rotary Connection with Minnie Riperton. Charles Stepney was a producer, an instrumentalist, jazz aficionado, and soul music developer who was so diverse in terms of his influences, and was also influential on Maurice with unifying different sounds, genres, and aesthetics and musical textures
to create the sound that we hear with, as mentioned, Earth, Wind, and Fire, Rotary Connection, and also Ramsey Lewis, who earlier I'd misquoted as saying created Sun God, but what I meant to say was the classic Sun Goddess.